All right, my name is Liz Levine, and I'm a gift officer at SAIS. I'm here with Tom Schlenker, and today is the 24th of September, and we're just going to have a conversation about your time at SAIS and career since then. So first, I'd like to ask you what brought you to SAIS originally.
Well, I came from the West Coast, and I was interested in the Foreign Service, and the professor that I was in his program said that there was this program at Johns Hopkins. It was very much oriented toward the practical, international relations and foreign affairs. And he thought it would be a good mix if you weren't going on for advanced degrees and academic work. So it was kind of an adventure for me because I had traveled to the Midwest but never been on the East Coast. And when I went to visit my grandmother in North Dakota, I had an uncle who had been in Washington from time to time, sort of a politico assistant type. And I said where I was going and what I was going to do, and he said, "Oh, that's an all-black area." So I didn't quite know what I was getting into. But we were at the old SAIS, so it was known by the McCarthy era people who had it in for Owen Lattimore, who was a professor at Johns Hopkins. He was an international specialist on Mongolia and considered very red, not even pink, but absolutely red. So they termed it the Little Red Schoolhouse on Florida Avenue. It had been a girls' school, and I guess it dated back to approximately around the time of the First World War. So it was this Georgian style. Couple stories. We actually had residences there. The first year I was there. The second year they said we don't have that room anymore, so you'll have to go outside and find a place to live. But it was all very interesting, and of course Washington was very exciting in those days. And you could go anywhere, any building you wanted to go. You could go into the library, you could go to the State Department, you could go to the World Bank, you could do all kinds of things, Library of Congress, etc. So nothing was barred, and the security was very limited. When I arrived, Priscilla Mason, of course, was the key to everything. She knew everything, and she set things up. And what they said was, well, you're going to be resident here in the building, and what we want to do is we want to place foreign students and American students together. Well, that lasted maybe not even a day. We had 3 Italian students, and they immediately went off and did their own thing, and roomed with each other. So there was kind of an American group that ended up living at the place. And there was kind of a group of people who were about as bewildered and fish out of water as I. So we kind of got together. One fellow came from Massachusetts. He'd been at Providence. And another fellow came from somewhere in Ohio. And he was going to do Arabic studies. And I think for me, the person that really was kind of the godfather there wasn't a professor or anything. It was the librarian, Frank Shork, who knew everything, how to get around. And so we were there between 18th and 19th Street. Now, 19th Street, there were these row of mansions that had once been residences, but some of them were occupied by SAIS, and some of them are occupied by the Scientology people. So he said, we'll never go close to those Scientology people. That will be bad for you and everybody else. So we had, the words of wisdom. And then he, because I worked in the library a little bit. I had worked when I was an undergraduate, so it didn't bother me at all. So he would come up and he'd say, well, I have these tickets to the Library of Congress. The Budapest String Quartet is playing. Would you like them? Oh, yes, that's wonderful. Of course, those tickets, every I guess it was Monday, people met downtown and they went to the box office, the music store box office, and you got for 2 tickets for $0.25 each. And it was part of the legacy of Mrs. Sprague Coolidge, who had set this, endowed the string quartet. And the Budapest String Quartet was considered the premier quartet for Beethoven, the Beethoven quartets. So it was a very elegant thing. And so he would sort of do little things like that to clue you into the cultural life of Washington. Also the Sunday concerts at the Phillips and things like that. So he didn't have much respect for the Library of Congress, but the Library of Congress was interesting to go there and just see it. It was hard to get stuff out of it. So anyway, the groups at SAIS in those days were very odd, and I thought, well, this is very East Coast, because there was a group from Princeton, and they were very well connected, and some of them were very wealthy, and it was kind of like their club, and they would come in, and there would be a lounge, and they'd all watch. And there was the puppet show, was a Washington, D.C. favorite in those days, and they'd all watch that, and that was very camp. And they had other little clues and things that they did. It was very strange. Before I went, they had one of the students in my class was married in Paris to the daughter of the general who was head of NATO. NATO was in Paris in those days. And Life magazine had the spread of his wedding. so it was very interesting to be around those people, but they had their own little group. And then there were just sort of odd people here and there that kind of floated around, did their own thing. And Johns Hopkins was very well known for letting the students come, sort of do their own thing and meet their reckoning, and that's about it. We didn't really have a great deal of contact with the faculty otherwise, because they had also a lot of faculty that came in from State Department, CIA, etc., and they gave various lectures. So it was very practical. There was an emphasis on writing, which you would encounter when you were in the Foreign Service, writing reports and things like that. So that was the first year. Second year, nobody lived in the building, and we just came in, did our classwork, etc. And that was the year that Kennedy was inaugurated in '61. So I came in '59, and the elections was in '60, and then '61 was the first year he was in office. And they had a huge snowstorm in Washington just before the inauguration, and they didn't let anybody leave. So there was an enormous tie-up of traffic, even though the suburbs were sort of Silver Spring and Arlington in those days. And people didn't go much beyond that. But the traffic was so snarled, people were tied up for hours. So that was kind of the introduction. And then the next day they had a very difficult time getting all the snow off Pennsylvania Avenue to have the parade done. But that was the sort of the big event. And then they started the Peace Corps, and so we were graduating, and so everybody said, well, I've just put in this application for the Peace Corps. Well, the government decided in their wisdom that if you went to the Peace Corps, you would not be absolved from going into the military. The draft was the big issue, and so several of us who had put in applications to the Peace Corps, been accepted, looked at each other and said, well, do you want to do this for 2 years and then be drafted afterward? So we said, no. So somebody said, I have an idea. There's a program at the Pentagon where you can go in as a reservist for 18 months, and they will assure you of language training in California at the Army Language School. And then you'll be released, and that'll be that. You probably won't be bothered. You should go to reserve meetings if you're in Washington, but if you're not in Washington, you're finished, more or less. So we went over there, we did physicals and all that. And one fellow, there were 2 of us at that point, and one fellow said, I want to go into something Oriental, so he went into Cantonese and signed up for that. And I went over and I said, I don't want Russian. My ancestors lived in a part of Russia and left because of, they didn't want their children to be, their sons to be drafted into the Russian military. So they left very early in the 1870s. And they're part of the Auslanddeutsch that were in Bessarabia and came over to the U.S. and went to Dakota, Nebraska, places like that. And incidentally, they brought with them the technology of building sod houses, which apparently they had used in the plains of Russia. So anyway, they said, well, there's Turkish, and I said, well, that sounds good. So they said, no, we're not doing Turkish. So I said, well, Serbo-Croatian, and they said, well, no, we're not doing that either. We're doing Hungarian. So I said, well, that, and Polish, and I thought, oh, no, not Northern Europe. So I said, okay, I'll take Hungarian. So we went into the military and did that, and went to Baltimore to the intelligence school for 6 weeks, and then were given train tickets to go to Monterey. So we went across country. And so in that respect, I got a hard language, and I had French in SAIS, and it just made it a little, you're a little more diverse when you went into the Foreign Service. I had a Foreign Service appointment, and I told them when I went to the oral that I would be going into the military and finish that. And they sort of looked, well, I didn't like that idea, but okay, I guess, blah, blah, that was it. And so when I finished with the military side of it, then the State Department picked me up, and I went in '63. And they had an orientation that lasted probably about 6 or 8 weeks, something like that. And then we went in, and they just sort of put you in an office somewhere to do whatever. And the State Department's, career started. I was sent to South Africa, which was sort of my background anyway, African studies, and met the other side of the State Department. And the first of my tours wasn't so terrific. you were supposed to go around to the various departments. I was in the consulate at Johannesburg, but the consul general had been what they call a Ristonee, because Mr. Riston was head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, and I think, or First National City Bank, and he had been in a blue ribbon committee drafting what the State Department should do with their personnel, what new reforms they should do. And he recommended that people at a certain level in the civil service be forcibly sent into the Foreign Service, for which they did not want to go, mainly, because they were established in D.C. and they didn't want to leave. But they were kind of required to do so if they wanted to keep their jobs. So this Consul General was one of those people. And he really wasn't a Foreign Service officer. Didn't fit the bill too well. But anyway, that's another story. So you find out about these things later. But of course, everything was quite different from now. Whenever time I get the Foreign Service magazine, there's something else that wouldn't have been possible that they're doing. So I guess if you wait 50 years, everything changes.
Are there any other, any particular classes or faculty members that stand out about your time at SAIS?
Well, the class I enjoyed the most was the one on European diplomatic history, even though I was African area studies. They had the head of the historical department of the State Department gave the lectures, and they were very fascinating, and he made them come alive very, very well. And I think if I hadn't taken the course, I wouldn't have understood the very complex nature of the Central European system. I mean, being in Budapest would have been, I probably wouldn't have gotten 50% of what I got out of it. And I mean, all of the factions and the positions and this position that the First World War was the powers were in and what they did, and then between the wars, the situation. And when you go to a place like Hungary or Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia, they look at, 500 years was like yesterday, and they don't forget anything. And the borders moved around, but people didn't, and there were Hungarian minorities in Romania and Czechoslovakia and even in Yugoslavia a bit. And I was there at the time. Cardinal Mincenti was in the embassy, so he would go over all of this stuff because he lived about 50 years in the past. And so it was very interesting to talk to him about things and his view and the communist takeover and all of that. So I think that was one of the classes that I enjoyed the most. And of course, Frank Shorrock at the library, who gave a certain perspective. And Shorrock sort of knew, he said, well, the fellow that was taking Arabic, he said, he should never have done that. He should have taken French or some other easier language, because he washed out in about the first semester. He was just gone. And he said, I could tell right away he wasn't going to make it. So it was, an interesting perspective.
You've talked a little bit about what you did after you graduated from SAIS in '61. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your career path since then?
Well, I was in the State Department for 28 years, and I went to several African posts. African posts were very interesting by and large because, well, this was the era shortly after independence. So I was in Tanzania for a couple months on TDY. I was in Cameroon. in the 70s, and there was always something interesting to see or do, even though the roads may be very bad. In Cameroon, the ambassador and the ambassador's wife and I went up country, and we went into the Muslim areas, which were completely different from Yaoundé, which was the capital, and the coastal lateral. This was all Muslim. It was very feudal, and we went to see this. He was actually a feudal lord, and he had a palace. It was a mud-walled palace with walls and crenellated balustrade up on top. And we went to see him, and actually as we were coming, we were approaching the area and crossing a river. So we crossed on foot, and then the car came across. He had to ford the river. It was during the dry season, so it wasn't a very big river. And these horsemen galloped up. Now, you don't have horsemen in the south because of the tsetse fly, but you do up north because it's very dry, and the flies are not a problem. So they galloped up and they said in French to the ambassador, "Are you arriving to see the Baba of Rebuba?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "We're coming." And he said, "Well, we will go ahead, prepare everything." So we went in, and he was on his throne. It was a chair that was elevated, and he was all swathed in a turban and dark glasses. You couldn't see anything. And he spoke the local language, and there was an interpreter, and the interpreter was down with his head on the ground, interpreting from French to the local language. And the ambassador had this little conversation with this fellow. And later we went to see the American missionaries, and they said, "Oh yes, he's very powerful." And his nephew had been co-opted by the government and was in Parliament or something. And so they were just waiting for him to say his last. He had been there since the Germans, and he was revered in the area. And I think he was probably extracted some sort of feudal obeisance from the local peasantry and whatnot. And he had, of course, many wives, and the wives, I think they sort of lined up as we left, and they gave us like little coasters that had been made out of reeds and things, which was something, little handicrafts that they did. So, and Africans have a marvelous sense of humor. I mean, not at all very serious. I don't think they take anything too seriously. So it was kind of fun to be in Africa, especially at that point when things had not, deteriorated and bad times had come. And being in Tanzania, I think we were there. I was there maybe a year after independence. So the British had left a very established military and police force. So they were quite impartial at that point. They still had the British sense of impartiality. And when I was there, I heard on the radio that they wanted O-negative blood, so I went and offered to give blood. And the doctor, this was a little kind of a small little house. It wasn't air conditioned or anything, so it was very hot and close. And he said, well, we've had this request out for quite a while. Why haven't you come in before? And I said, well, I just came and I just heard about this. And he said, well, the last time, and they wanted O negative because O negative is neutral, can be given to anyone. And he said, well, the last time we had a good supply of blood was when a U.S. Navy ship came in. And they all were marched off and volunteered blood. So, I mean, little things like that made it very interesting.
Great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about your career or any other stories?
Well, of course, I was in Vietnam during the war, and that was part of the pacification movement. And I think everybody, this was sort of toward the end, this was 70 to 72, and by 72 you could pretty well see we were winding down and leaving, and the people we dealt with, the Vietnamese we dealt with, couldn't quite believe it. You're not going away. Don't you have this kind of supply for us? Don't you have that? So we don't have anything anymore. And so you could kind of, good luck to you guys because we're leaving. Then I went to the Philippines. The Philippines was completely different from any post I'd ever been to. And people would go there and they say, oh, thank God these people speak English. Well, they sort of spoke English. But it was very different. I mean, I knew Filipinos in the U.S. who were Americanized, completely different. Filipinos in the Philippines, well, they could ask you just about anything. And they wanted to know all about your family life and this and that and the other thing. They ask all kinds of questions. And, of course, they were very friendly, but it was completely different from having been in a communist country where people were very hesitant to say anything really too much. And if they did, they had to know you very well. And I remember we went to, I had a little party, and I invited my local staff over, and they came, and in front of our apartment there was a uniformed policeman. And I guess they had to pass through him and tell him what they were doing there. And so they came in, but then they came in and they were very relieved. And they said, oh, we can let our hair down now, we can have fun. And we were dancing chardash and everything, having a good time. But then one of my other colleagues had a party, and he invited somebody that they had known, the hairdresser for the wife. And my locals didn't like that. They said, we don't know who these people are, and you can't really, be having a good time with somebody you don't know because things will get back. So, I mean, you go to different places and you have to really, it takes about 2 years to really feel you're comfortable in a place. You gradually, come to feel that, yeah, I know this, I've been through this before, this is what you do now, this is what you do again somewhere else. And, now I look at it, was the old Foreign Service. When I interviewed people in Budapest, you would invite them into your office, you talk with them face to face, and you made it, something that was very personal. You don't do that anymore. There's a bulletproof glass that you're talking through. You're talking through microphones. People don't feel at ease at all. I'm sure it's a very nerve-wracking ordeal for somebody on the other side to be talking. I mean, security is so much more prevalent. And we had, that embassy was just, it was kind of a joke. I mean, we had to take the cardinal out in the courtyard of the building. Well, the building was 3 sides was the American embassy, but the 4th side was open to an apartment house, which was next to the National Bank. And I'm sure the apartment house, there were probably the police families lived in there, and they could look right out and see the cardinal. So you had to walk in front of that building when he paced back and forth. You had to walk in front of him to protect him from anything that could happen. And one time we had police around during the day, but they were plain clothes. And then at night they'd bring out the uniformed police, and they'd have the Kalashnikovs over their shoulder. And one time they were going to have a children's party, and so they said, well, you can be Santa Claus, and we'll take you to the theater, and we'll dress you up like St. Nick, a la European style. So they have a beard, and they dip the eyes and everything. And then they have this long cassock type thing that went down. And so when I came into the embassy, they came right up to me, and they looked right in my face. And they wanted to see who this was going in, because if the cardinal left, that might be a way for him to escape. So you had to go through things like that.
Well, that's great. Thank you for sharing these stories. Do you have any advice for current SAIS students who are just embarking on their career?
Well, of course, the range of opportunities are enormously greater than they were in the early 60s. So I think that they get probably a much more in-depth type of study. We were very general. We had there was economics, there was history, there was very little else beside your major. And so nowadays you can do all kinds of things, and just take advantage of that. Washington is still a very interesting place, and people will come and talk to you and all that. I don't know if you can get into buildings anymore the way you used to. Use their library facilities, talk to people. That I couldn't even get into buildings after 9/11, and I had a pass. It was supposed to be a retirement pass. So things have changed a lot, but you still have all of the embassy contacts and things like that you can use. And so I imagine people get a much more in-depth in their particular areas, and it's a wonderful program in that respect.
Well, thank you very much.